All right, we've been bringing this up all the way through, and we're going to continue down that path. But let's talk about the risks. All right, pen test is by its nature is not without risk. Why? Because we're using tools to hack into systems, and the risk cannot be eliminated, but it can be controlled. In other words, depending on how we do the attacks, how we're doing the exploits, what tools we're using, who's doing it, there's a bunch of different factors.
And what we're targeting, right?
And what we're targeting.
Scope and rules of engagement.
Absolutely.
But the thing is that you just have to realize this. The good guys and the bad guys are using the same tools.
That they did not invent.
Right, we're all using Kali Linux, which is offensive securities operating system with attacks built in.
Yep.
We're all using the same tools, whether we want to or not. We're going to GitHub and downloading the tools to break in, because that's how you do it. The bad guys lead here. If a new tool comes out that the bad guys are using, I guarantee it will show up in the next version of Kali Linux.
And sometimes it's the bad guys taking advantage of tools that good guys have written and posted publicly. So it goes both ways.
Yeah, and what we're concerned about is embedding things in the tool themselves that then tells them about your vulnerabilities, or worse, when they exploit, it gives them access, right? Or leave something behind to give them access later, a Trojan or something else. So we really want to address the risks, and we had defined what we would consider the top 8. Potential system outages, right? What if it crashes the system, period? When we were talking to Ron earlier before we began, he said, yeah, one time I almost hacked the power grid as part of a hacking competition in the building that they were in, right? Because you're hacking, you don't know what it is until you figure it out. Well, he figured it out a few moments, I assume.
Shortly before I brought down HVAC and power to where we were doing the actual.
So that's one of the concerns here. You have to be careful about pen testing. And it can create sensitive data exposure and collateral damage. Okay, what do we say there? Well, we figured out how to get in. If somebody else is piggybacking, they could get that data, right? They could get a hold of it, or they might leave something behind, I don't know, like ransomware.
You could also have data loss. So
if they destroy something.
Yep, something that's very common is as you're trying to do, for example, SQL injection attacks, you can really mess up the database in question if it's actually vulnerable to SQL injection. You can completely mess up the database.
Yeah, and that really leads into the next one too. When we're talking about you're inviting somebody in to attack you. Well, trust is a key issue, right? And what do we always say? Trust but verify. Well, you got to verify your people. And in this case, you got to verify their testers, right? Somebody else. And they must know what they're doing so that the risk is less likely they're going to destroy the data or take out the system. But it's still a risk, in my opinion.
Yeah, and especially, I mean, these tools will sometimes have those side effects.
Yeah, when we talk about unexpected software flaws that create a DOS, a denial of service. In other words, they broke it. We keep saying that in different ways. It's the same thing. What about device misconfiguration? Unexpected device misconfiguration. Can it leave devices then vulnerable afterwards? Or did we not know about it to begin with and they found it? But so did the bad guys.
Right. If I'm not able to gain total control of a network switch, a smart switch, but I'm able to reset it to factory default that has a default password, now I've successfully owned the switch, and maybe by setting it to factory default, we have left some other thing besides the password. I put in the report, I changed the password, make sure you set it back to the way it was. Well, maybe there were some other things about the switch when I did that, when I set it to factory defaults, that also got misconfigured that then get missed. Yeah, so absolutely. it can leave issues.
Yeah. And then resetting will almost always also take away any patches that have been applied.
That's a great point. Or apply new vulnerabilities that were patched, right? Because we went backwards and rolled something in there, and that vulnerability was part of an earlier dependency. Those are real concerns. Backdoor vulnerability can invite unwanted guests, to Alex's point, back to default, and they found it too. And now it's default. Guess what? They're in. Test conditions need to be realistic, right? So here's where we get into two concerns. One, it can actually destroy it because we're realistically attacking it with real tools in the same way the bad guys were. Or two, it's not testing it enough because we've constrained the test And so therefore it's not a true test. And we get into a false sense of security, relying on something that was been pen tested, I'm using air quotes, but wasn't really, right? Or was it enough? And that's really where you get into false negatives, right? Hey, everything's secure because I didn't get in. Doesn't mean it's actually really secure when somebody else tries, right? When they use a different methodology, back to Ron's point. It depends on who's doing it and what they're doing it with. And this is where we come back to the testing is a path of least resistance, not a thorough audit. By definition, pen testing doesn't test for everything. It doesn't have to unless you define the scope accordingly. So in other words, maybe an assessment might be what's right here. But if you're going to then exploit the vulnerability as part of a pen test, we want to make sure that that assessment is as comprehensive as possible, right?
And you might have a separate engagement. Do a vulnerability assessment and a pen test if you think that a pen test is right for your environment.
Agreed.
You can assume the risks.
Very, very important facts, and something that we keep going on. And then we talk about firewalls were only one layer of depth, right? Well, 70% of the time, there's some kind of misconfiguration that allows the bad guys in. So here's why. Well, it's complex. I've seen firewalls with thousands and thousands of rules. And all it takes is one rule left slightly too open and the bad guys get in. So here's where you want it to tie things down and make sure it's as tight as possible so that the pen test hopefully doesn't find anything, right? That's really a key goal here so that we're understanding what kind of traffic, how's it getting through, what that traffic looks like. Because once the bad guys get in, they're in. And in this case, that bad guy might be your pen tester, right? So let's really talk about it. Who will watch the watchers? Who's watching those pen testers? Who understands that they're sticking to the scope they're required to, right? And what tools are they using? Here's where we get into the hey, it's a million lines of code. Did you read each line to look for backdoors and Trojans and other vulnerabilities it could leave behind? Lack of tester skills and custom testing exploits, right? So we really want to understand our testers. We really want to make sure they're doing the job and they're going to do the best job possible, but they're also going to do it in a way that doesn't destroy us, right? Even if they're successful. And then we have to make sure that that information that they've gathered through their pen test doesn't get leaked, right? Some tools could retain that and then publish it. That would be really bad.
One of the things I spoke of earlier is that we all use Kali Linux. Kali Linux is an amazing security attack system and is the least secured version of an operating system I have ever seen.
It's certainly true.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
Very easy, they download something because that's what you hired them to do. And they may or may not have any security on their own system, whether they mean to or not, because it's very easy to misconfigure Kali. I've done it. I don't know if anyone else here has.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Or I'm not sure I configured it perfectly. How about that? It's hard to be perfect in this world. And so when you set up something, I always take a new device, I install Kali on it, and when I'm done, I wipe the device. I don't use it for then checking my email or anything else, or my bank accounts, or connecting into the heart of the network. I don't do that. I will reset it and start over, right, from the beginning. And sometimes replacing hardware is important too, as part of that process. And then we want to make sure that management imposes scope and the restrictions accordingly, but not so that it makes the test useless, right? If they're going to do a pen test, well, it has to be useful. The findings have to be accurate so we don't get into the false negatives.